I've always believed that real leadership doesn't come with a title, it comes with quiet consistency. For 18 years, I was that constant presence in the branding department at Straighten & Vail, a mid-sized marketing agency based in Seattle. I started there when the team was 3 people and the company couldn't afford coffee for the office kitchen. I built our branding arm from scratch. Frameworks, tone guides, full-scale campaigns that help secure million-dollar clients. I trained every strategist who passed through my department. Some went on to bigger jobs, some stayed and became friends, and others eventually forgot where they learned to think. That never bothered me. My reward wasn't recognition, it was watching things work because I'd made them work. I wasn't flashy, I didn't post on LinkedIn about crushing goals or scaling authenticity like the newer crowd did. I didn't believe in faking a personal brand, I believed in building real ones for real companies. That's what made my work matter. Clients didn't stay with us because we were trendy, they stayed because they trusted me, because I listened. Because I could translate abstract business problems into brand strategy that actually delivered results. That's what kept me grounded, even when the agency began to change. The change wasn't sudden, but it was unmistakable. It started with new faces in the boardroom, consultants, then a new COO, then a rebranded mission statement that read like something spit out by a buzzword generator. Words like velocity, virality, attention economy were suddenly everywhere. We were told to be younger and louder. I remember one meeting where someone half my age suggested our agency needed a heartbeat on TikTok. I didn't even disagree, I just asked what our core message would be there, what we'd say that meant something. The room went quiet, and I realized I wasn't speaking their language anymore. Then came the internal reshuffling. My department started getting cut out of early-stage pitches. I was no longer invited to cross-functional planning sessions I used to lead. Instead, I was asked to submit decks for review by teams that hadn't even existed 2 months prior. It was humiliating, but subtle. Not the kind of thing you could complain about without sounding paranoid. And so I kept my head down. I focused on my clients, hit my deliverables, mentored the younger team members who still sought my advice. But I saw it coming. The writing was on the wall. It just hadn't been underlined yet. One morning, I walked into the office and felt it in my bones. This was going to be the day. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. There was an all-hands meeting at 10 a.m., a calendar invite from HR. A tight, polite email, let's touch base. When I opened the glass door to the conference room, Kendra Lowell was already sitting there. She didn't stand. She smiled like she'd won something. Kendra had been brought on as head of digital transformation. She was 31, always perfectly dressed, always quoting articles I knew she hadn't read fully. Her claim to fame was a viral campaign involving dancing nurses during COVID. I never had anything against her personally. She just didn't know what we did, and worse, she didn't care to learn. For her, branding was a performance, not a foundation, and I was an inconvenience to that. The conversation was as brief as it was cold. Valerie, we've been reviewing structure and trying to align with more current engagement strategies, she said, as if reading from a laminated script. We believe your contributions have been incredibly valuable, but we're moving toward a more dynamic content model. It's time to evolve. I didn't speak right away. I just nodded. She thought I'd argue or cry or beg. I did none of those things. I thanked her for the opportunity, even if she hadn't been the one to give it to me. She smiled again, this time relieved, and handed me the severance packet. Just like that. 18 years and I was being replaced by a TikTok coach from Los Angeles. I packed my things that afternoon, no dramatic goodbyes, a few quiet hugs. I left my office as clean as the day I walked into it. When the elevator doors closed behind me, I didn't cry, not yet. I just stood still and listened to the silence. And in that silence, one truth echoed. They had no idea what they'd just done. I spent the first week after my dismissal in a haze. I didn't rush to update my resume or announce a new chapter online. I didn't even tell my friends right away. Instead, I walked through the house like a ghost, alternating between long silences and sudden waves of rage that felt out of character. I wasn't the kind of woman who wallowed, but something about the way it all ended, it was like being re-raced. Not fired in a blaze of conflict, not celebrated as a veteran leaving on her terms, just removed, quietly, strategically, like a liability they couldn't wait to unload. By the end of that first week, my inbox had begun to fill. At first, it was just the usual automated transitions, calendar permissions revoked, access cut off, corporate passwords disabled. But then, the real messages started coming in. A junior strategist I had mentored wrote me a short email. "It's chaos here. The TikTok girl doesn't understand the clients. I just wanted to say thank you for everything you taught me." Another one was bolder. "Val, they made a huge mistake. I've already had 2 calls where the client flat out asked where you were." A partner from a logistics client I'd handled for 6 years wrote, "Heard you're no longer with S&V. Honestly, can't say I'm surprised. They've been running weird lately. If you ever go solo, we'd love to chat." The last message struck a nerve. I read it 3 times. "If you ever go solo." I hadn't considered it, not seriously. I was tired, I was bitter, but the idea wouldn't let go. I wasn't done. I still had ideas, clients still trusted me, my name still meant something, and more importantly, I knew how this industry worked, far better than the people who had replaced me. They were betting on clicks and views. I had spent almost 2 decades understanding behavior, nuance, and strategy. There was no comparison. They had made their move and it was loud and flashy. Now I had to decide whether I'd make mine. The next few days were a flurry of motion. I pulled out old notebooks and drive backups, digging into the systems and frameworks I had developed before Stratton and Valley ever existed in its current form. My brand archetype matrix, the layered messaging hierarchy, the behavioral segmentation flow, all things I'd built independently during freelance years, long before they were brought into the company. And legally, they were still mine. I had never signed over IP rights to those early works. They were integrated, yes, but only as licensed assets. I had the paperwork to prove it. I scheduled a call with a lawyer I trusted, a woman named Danielle, who'd helped me set up a tiny LLC a decade ago when I briefly considered freelancing full-time. She reviewed everything. After 2 hours and a few thoughtful questions, she looked at me over Zoom and said, "Valerie, you have more leverage than you realize. You own the bones of that agency's product. You just need to put flesh on them." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from adrenaline. I lay awake thinking about names, structures, what kind of company I'd actually want to run. Not a replica of Sturton and Vail. Something smaller, more agile, intimate, focused, not bloated by trend chasing or layers of approval. I'd call it Signal Route Consulting, not flashy but grounded. The name spoke to what I always believed, that real brand strength starts deep beneath the surface. Within a week, I had registered the business, set up a simple website, bought a domain, and hired a freelance designer to help clean up the brand kit. I reached out to the client who had messaged me, Norbridge Tech, a SaaS company I'd worked with for 5 years. We met for coffee in a neutral cafe downtown. The head of marketing, Sarah, greeted me like an old friend. She wasted no time. "We've already pulled our monthly contract from S&V. The new team didn't get us. They pitched an Instagram Reels campaign for an enterprise IT tool. It was insulting. We want to move forward with you, just you. We trust you." It wasn't a massive deal, but it was enough. Enough to validate the choice, enough to fund my first month of operations and send a message, quietly, discreetly, that I wasn't finished. I called up an old colleague, Priya, who'd left the agency a year ago, brilliant strategist. She joined as a contractor in a heartbeat. Then I brought on Jonah, a creative director who'd gone freelance after burning out under Kendra's new structure. Within 3 weeks, we had a team, small but sharp. Meanwhile, the news trickled in from inside S&V. The TikTok coach, her name was Harper, was floundering. Her first campaign went live and was mocked online for being tone deaf. One of my former clients told me confidentially that Kendra was furious and had called an emergency meeting with the digital team. I smiled, not out of pettiness, but because I'd seen it coming. These people had no patience for foundations. They wanted fireworks. But branding isn't a spark, it's architecture, it's structure and storytelling. You can't viral your way out of strategic ignorance. At the same time, I kept my public face composed, no gloating posts, no subtextual jabs. I simply began publishing thought pieces again on LinkedIn, just like I used to. Essays about long-term brand equity, about the difference between engagement and resonance, about the dangerous race to stay relevant at the cost of authenticity. They performed better than I expected. People shared them, commented. Even a few S&V employees liked them, quietly, of course. Then came the call, a number I recognized but hadn't saved. It was one of the board members from Straighten and Vale, David, an older man who'd always respected my work, even if he rarely said it outright. "Valerie," he said, "I've been following your writing. I think we need to talk, off the record." As I hung up, I looked around my small but growing office, just a co-working space with decent coffee and too much whiteboard, but it was mine, my strategy, my name on the paperwork. 2 months ago, I'd been discarded. Now they were calling me back, not for advice, for help. And that's when I knew they didn't fire me because I was irrelevant. They fired me because they didn't understand what I was worth, but they were about to find out. I met David at a quiet hotel lounge downtown, the kind of place where executives took meetings they didn't want recorded in calendars. He looked older than I remembered, tired maybe, but still sharp in that calculating way board members tended to be. We exchanged pleasantries over black coffee, and then he got straight to the point. "Kendra's initiatives aren't landing," he said. "Clients are pulling out. We've had 3 QBRs end with the phrase, 'This isn't what we signed up for.'" I didn't smile, though I felt the urge. "I'm not surprised," I replied, "but I'm not sure why you're telling me." He hesitated, then leaned forward. "Because we want you to come back, not as an employee, as a consultant. Help us course correct, get the core accounts stable, quietly." And there it was. The moment I'd visualized a dozen times, but hadn't expected to arrive this soon. I sipped my coffee slowly, weighing my words. "You're asking me to fix what you broke without acknowledging that you broke it." He didn't argue, didn't apologize either, just nodded. "You'll have full autonomy," he said. "No direct reporting line to Kendra. You'll work with us, not under her. She'll be informed, but not involved." I asked for a few days to think. He agreed. Back at the office, I told Priya and Jonah everything. Their reactions were mixed, as expected. "So you're going to save them?" Priya asked, raising an eyebrow, "after they tossed you like an old coat?" "No," I said. "I'm going to help the clients I care about, and I'm going to make sure no one like Kendra gets to define this industry's future unchallenged." Jonah leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Just make sure they don't pull you back in as a pawn." "They won't," I said. "I'm not the same person who walked out of that building." The truth was, I didn't need S&V anymore, but I knew how they operated. I knew their systems, their processes, their weaknesses, and I knew how to rebuild them better than the people currently in charge. This wasn't about ego. It was about reclaiming control. On my terms. I sent my terms the next morning, a 6-month contract, executive-level authority over brand strategy on legacy accounts, freedom to select my team and tools, no interference from Kendra's department. And, this part was important, public acknowledgement that I was returning as an external partner, not as a rehired employee. If I was going back in, it had to be clear who was leading. They agreed by the afternoon. I didn't ask how desperate they were. I didn't need to. Walking back into the building was surreal. Everything looked the same. Polished glass, sleek white walls, minimalist furniture. But it felt different. I wasn't on the inside anymore. I was a visitor with leverage. Kendra wasn't there when I arrived, which suited me fine. I went straight to the boardroom, where David introduced me to a few new department heads. Most of them were unfamiliar faces. Some gave me polite, uncertain nods. Others looked visibly relieved. I recognized that look. It meant, finally, someone who knows what they're doing. I spent the next 2 weeks in deep triage mode. I met with 3 of the biggest clients S&V had left, Norbridge Tech, Lawson Freight, and Alari Medical. Each had the same story: confused messaging, performative campaigns, poor ROI. The TikTok push had resulted in temporary spikes, but zero long-term engagement. Brand consistency had fractured. Audience trust was slipping when clients said, "We're not selling sneakers to teenagers, we're selling infrastructure. Why are we being told to post trending audios?" I didn't defend S&V. I didn't deflect. I listened, took notes, and promised them clarity. Then I got to work. I started by gutting the fluff. I removed unnecessary campaign layers, killed vanity KPIs, and refocused the strategy on 3 core metrics: retention, conversion depth, and industry positioning. I reintroduced frameworks I'd built years ago, quietly, efficiently. I brought in Priya to lead analytics and Jonah to oversee creative. We didn't ask permission, we just delivered. Within a month, the difference was obvious. Engagement dropped slightly, predictably, since we weren't chasing clicks, but lead quality improved. Client feedback turned positive. One account rep emailed me after a presentation and wrote, "That felt like the old days." You have no idea what that means to us. The tension with Kendra simmered beneath the surface. She was aware of my return, of course, she couldn't ignore it, but she never confronted me directly. Instead, I started noticing little things: her name missing from update chains, her teams avoiding meetings I was scheduled to lead. Once, we passed each other in the hallway. She gave me a tight-lipped smile and said, "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." I smiled back. "I go where the problems are," she laughed, sharp and hollow, and walked on. That was our only direct interaction for weeks. Then came the email from Harper, the TikTok coach. It was brief. "I'm sorry if I played a part in what happened to you. I thought I was helping, but I see now I was in over my head." I stared at it for a long time before replying. We've all been in over our heads. What matters is what we do once we realize it. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The next week I was informed she had resigned. As for Kendra, the cracks were beginning to show. One of her flagship projects had failed spectacularly. An influencer-led partnership that tanked within 48 hours of launch due to backlash over tone-deaf messaging. Internally, fingers pointed in every direction, but I knew the board had begun to lose patience. David called me in privately one afternoon. "The numbers are turning, that's thanks to you. We're considering change." I nodded but didn't ask for details. I wasn't interested in her downfall. I was interested in rebuilding something that would outlast the trend chasers. By the end of the quarter, client retention was up 17%, and 3 former clients had re-signed with the agency. My team operated like a shadow task force, lean, fast, effective. I held weekly briefings directly with the board. I had no title, no desk, no formal badge, but I ran the brand strategy department. Everyone knew it. There was a moment, late one evening, reviewing campaign data alone in a quiet conference room, when I looked up at the whiteboard and realized something. I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't trying to prove anything, wasn't coming back. I was already ahead. I had taken everything they tried to strip from me and built something stronger with it. I wasn't just fixing what they broke, I was rewriting the rules. And they were letting me, because now they knew the woman they thought was obsolete had been the foundation all along. 3 weeks into the contract, I started getting invitations to meetings I wasn't technically supposed to be part of. Department heads began CCing me on planning threads Kendra was meant to lead. There was no formal memo, no big announcement, but the hierarchy had started to shift, quietly, deliberately. And while Kendra still held her title, the decision-making no longer flowed through her. It passed through me. What surprised me wasn't that the board allowed this, it was how fast the team adapted. People who had once been afraid to be seen talking to me were now asking for feedback, scheduling one-on-ones, sending documents for review. At first, I wondered if it was opportunism, but then I saw the relief behind their emails. The exhaustion, the hunger for structure, clarity, logic. Kendra had chased visibility and virality. I offered foundation and purpose. In a company that was unraveling at the seams, that was more valuable than buzzwords on a whiteboard. And even as I stepped into that quiet leadership role, I kept my guard up. I knew this arrangement was temporary. I knew the board wasn't loyal to anyone, they were loyal to numbers. The minute those numbers looked stable again, I could be shelved just as easily. So instead of basking in the influence, I focused on what I knew best: long-term positioning. Not just for the agency, but for myself. At night, after calls and strategy reviews, I worked on Signal Route's second phase. We were still a small operation, but I was laying groundwork, building partnerships, expanding contracts, designing a content platform to publish insights that could reach decision makers outside my immediate network. The LinkedIn posts I had begun months earlier were gaining traction. Quietly, I was becoming a voice in the industry again. not just behind the scenes, but in front of the right people. My writing was measured but pointed. I never named names, never mentioned S&V, but anyone who'd been paying attention knew who I was referring to. The pieces dissected the collapse of depth in modern brand strategy, the fetishization of real-time content, the absurdity of replacing relationship building with trends. Comments rolled in from CMOs, VPs, ex-colleagues. Some disagreed, most applauded. A few asked if I was taking on new clients. Then came the panel invite. It was from a boutique business conference in Austin. Topic: Sustainable Brand Identity in the Noise Economy. I hadn't spoken publicly in years, but the pitch was compelling. A small, invite-only crowd, no live stream, a space for real discussion. I accepted. When I arrived, I recognized half the attendees from past campaigns and boardrooms. People I hadn't seen since long before my departure from S&B, but something had changed. They weren't talking about growth hacks or Gen Z pipelines. They were talking about meaning, longevity, credibility. The pendulum, it seemed, was swinging back. When it was my turn on stage, I didn't pull punches. I spoke about how companies were cannibalizing their own brands for the sake of short-term engagement. I shared anonymous stories, one about an agency that replaced experienced strategists with influencers, another about a campaign that went viral for all the wrong reasons. People laughed in recognition. No one asked me to name the agency. They didn't need to. The talk was quoted online within hours. It wasn't massive, it didn't go viral, but it hit the right audience. And among that audience, word spread. Back at S&V, David called me into his office. "You're getting attention," he said, placing his phone on the table with a LinkedIn post from one of the panelists pulled up. "Good attention," he added quickly, perhaps catching my expression. "We think it might be time to formalize your position here, make it permanent." I didn't answer immediately. I looked out the window of his office, across the skyline I'd seen 100 times before. Then I turned back. "That depends," I said. "Will I be inheriting a department or cleaning up after one?" He didn't flinch. "We're discussing options." I knew what that meant. Kendra was being evaluated, and I was the control variable against which she was being measured. Part of me recoiled at the idea of a power grab. It wasn't what I was after. But another part, the one that remembered that cold meeting room months ago, understood that stepping aside would just invite the next Kendra. This wasn't about personal redemption. It was about redefining the standard. So I made a decision. I called a closed-door meeting with 3 senior team members who had remained loyal to S&V through all the chaos. I laid out a new structure. Cross-functional pods, client-embedded brand strategists, quarterly immersion sprints. It was a model I had been developing for Signal Route, but now I tested it here. No more TikTok calendars for industries that don't need them, I said. No more growth theater, just real work done smartly. The team latched onto the model immediately. It gave them clarity, focus, permission to stop pretending everything was fine. One of them, a quiet project manager who had survived 3 rounds of layoffs, said after the meeting, "It finally feels like we're building something again." The final thread came a week later when I received a call from Harper, the former TikTok coach. She sounded calm, tired, but grateful. "I wanted you to know I took a job with a creative studio in Portland. No brands, just storytelling. It's what I should have been doing from the beginning." I told her I was happy for her, and I meant it. She hadn't been the villain. She had been a symptom of a system that traded substance for style. Invigorated, got caught in the fallout. Kendra, however, was not so lucky. That same week, David informed me that the board had voted to relieve her of her role. It was framed as a restructuring, of course, polite, muted. She would be pursuing new opportunities. She sent a single all-staff email thanking everyone for the chance to work alongside them. No mention of her results, no mention of me. And that was fine. I didn't need the acknowledgement. I didn't need an apology. I had already built the thing they said I couldn't. I had already reclaimed the reputation they thought they could strip away. The only difference now was that everyone knew it. When I returned to my own office later that day, I sat down at my desk, opened my notebook, and wrote a single sentence. "They gave me silence. I turned it into structure." Then I closed the notebook, leaned back in my chair, and let myself breathe. The rebuild had begun, but this time it was mine. The strange thing about winning is that it rarely looks the way you imagined it. When I'd first walked out of Straighten and Veil with a severance packet and a polite smile masking 18 years of betrayal, I'd pictured the perfect revenge. I'd return in glory. They'd beg for my help, and I'd have the power to turn them down with a cool one-liner and walk off into a better life. But when the call came, when they did ask for help, I hadn't turned them down and said yes, not out of spite, not even for closure. I said yes because I wanted to fix what had been broken, not for them, but for the clients, the team, and for the version of myself that had spent nearly 2 decades building something that still mattered. That version of me hadn't needed revenge. She needed resolution. With Kindra gone, the company's structure had become malleable again, soft clay I could shape if I moved fast enough. The board gave me the green light to implement the strategy model I'd proposed during our private sessions, and this time, they didn't just approve it, they endorsed it. I was given full operational control of the brand department and the leadership title to match, but I requested that it be issued under my own consultancy's umbrella. I didn't want a desk job, I wanted leverage. I wasn't stepping back into a system that had failed me, I was building a system around it. The first move I made was to collapse the siloed structures that had bloated the agency over the past 2 years. Departments had become echo chambers, digital chasing trends, strategy buried in decks, creative reduced to Canva templates with no soul. I brought everyone to the same table, literally. Weekly roundtables, no slides, no posturing, just talk. What are we hearing from clients? What's actually working? What are we doing that we're too afraid to admit isn't? At first, there was resistance, but the results came fast. 1 month in, client engagement sessions stopped sounding like sales pitches and started sounding like collaborations again. Our net promoter scores, which had been hovering at a dangerous low, shot up by 14 points. Then came the second phase, bringing people back. Not just clients, talent. The good ones who had left when things got chaotic. I made a list of 10 former employees I trusted, people who had built great work under pressure and didn't chase clout. I called each one. No fluff, no begging, just, I'm rebuilding, on my terms, 1 in. 7 said yes immediately. 2 needed a week. 1 said no and then called back a month later asking if the offer still stood. It did. I wasn't in the business of gatekeeping opportunities. I was in the business of rebuilding dignity. As the agency began to stabilize, I saw the third phase emerge almost on its own. The clients came back. Slowly at first. One former partner who'd quietly followed my LinkedIn posts reached out and said, "We're thinking about coming back to S&V, but only if you're involved." Another, who had cut ties during Kendra's reign, messaged me after reading a case study we'd published under the new model. "That feels like your voice. Are you back?" It was never about me as a name. It was about what I stood for. They trusted that. They remembered. Somewhere in the middle of this rebuilding, the TikTok coach Harper resurfaced in an unexpected way. She sent me a handwritten note. It wasn't long, but it was sincere. She said she'd taken a job at a nonprofit storytelling lab in Portland. No brands, no algorithms, just real narratives. She thanked me for not humiliating her, for not retaliating. I pinned the note to the corkboard behind my desk. It reminded me that grace is louder than revenge, if you're patient. But not everyone left quietly. There was a senior strategist who had aligned himself with Kendra's new wave and hadn't changed his tone even after her departure. He openly questioned my authority in meetings, made side comments about legacy thinking, and tried to sabotage one of the creative team's pitches by slipping in last-minute edits to the deck. I called him into my office. No theatrics, no anger, just facts. I laid out the metrics from the pitch, the revised feedback, and the internal notes he didn't think I had access to. "This isn't about control," I told him. "It's about clarity. If you want to be part of what we're building, be honest about your intentions. If not, I'll write you the kindest reference letter you've ever received." He quit 2 days later. I didn't flinch. Meanwhile, Signal Root continued to grow. What had started as a survival project was now a thriving consultancy in its own right. I had 3 clients under that brand, a speaking engagement lined up in Boston, and a book proposal sitting with an agent. I wasn't just rebuilding one agency. I was building my own lane entirely. And the best part? They coexisted. S&V knew about Signal Route. The board knew I had other clients. They didn't mind. In fact, they respected it. For once, I was allowed to operate on multiple fronts without being treated like a traitor. Then came the final moment I hadn't expected. David called me in again. The board wants to know if you'd consider an acquisition. I blinked. Of what? Of Signal Route. Full buyout. You'd fold it into SV, take an executive seat, run brand and thought leadership globally. I didn't say anything at first. He kept going. It would mean budget, expansion, full team. You'd be the voice of our future. I took a breath and then smiled. I appreciate the offer, but I didn't build Signal Route to hand it over. I built it because no one gave me a seat until I made one myself. He nodded, slowly. Can we keep working together then? Absolutely, I said. But on contract, always. I walked out of that office lighter than I'd ever felt in that building. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about reclaiming authorship over my career. I hadn't burned the bridge. I had rebuilt it. But now I chose who got to cross. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, that choice belonged entirely to me. The moment I turned down the acquisition offer, something shifted inside me. It wasn't anger or pride, it was clarity. I realized I had stopped asking for approval a long time ago. Somewhere between getting fired and getting invited back, I had stopped needing someone else to validate my ideas. And once you're no longer performing for someone else's recognition, everything becomes simpler. You see politics for what they are. You stop second-guessing your instincts. You stop waiting for someone to say yes, and most importantly, you start saying no with confidence. That clarity became a weapon, not one I wielded loudly, but one that cut through the noise in every boardroom I walked into. People could feel it. They knew I wasn't playing for position. I had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. I didn't want anyone's job. I wanted the work to be better, cleaner, more real. That kind of energy unsettles the ones who rely on chaos and ego to stay relevant, but it galvanizes the people who actually want to do the work. Those people started coming to me in waves. Within a month of that conversation with David, Signal Route received 3 new consulting requests from companies that had watched what happened at S&V from a distance. They weren't just curious about my strategy frameworks, they were drawn to how I'd handled the transition. You didn't throw anyone under the bus, one CEO told me on a discovery call. You just kept walking forward like the bus never mattered. I laughed at that, but it stayed with me. Reputation wasn't about press or followers, it was about how you move when the lights are off. Back at S&V, the cultural shift was accelerating. With Kendra's influence gone and the new model I'd implemented showing real results, people stopped whispering and started building again. The ideas were better, the meetings were tighter, the clients were happier. We had gone from retention mode to growth mode in under 4 months. For the first time in years, the agency wasn't chasing relevance, it was defining it. And because I was technically a consultant, not a full-time executive, I could float between departments without triggering turf wars or power struggles. My presence didn't threaten anyone on paper, but in practice, I had become the gravity point around which everything was recalibrating. Still, not everyone adapted. There were holdovers from the Kendra era who had learned to survive by blending in, riding the noise, mimicking vision without offering any. They had been comfortable in chaos because it gave them cover. Now, under structure and clarity, they had nowhere to hide. One in particular, a senior brand manager named Elliot, had been known for selling slide decks with big empty words and making them sound like strategy. He had managed to stay afloat for years by attaching himself to louder personalities and echoing whatever trend was safe to echo. With my return, his work came under new scrutiny. I didn't target him, his own output did that. When we reviewed his latest proposal for a major fintech client, I asked one question: what problem is this solving? He had no answer, just buzzwords. I didn't reprimand him. I simply pulled the client brief and reassigned it to a mid-level strategist who had done great work quietly for months. The brief was returned within 48 hours. Sharp, clear, focused. The client signed off with no revisions. Elliot resigned the following week. I didn't send a farewell email. By the end of the quarter, Signal Route was running at near capacity, and S&V had fully adopted the hybrid model I had proposed. Clients no longer worked with teams, they worked with pods curated specifically to their needs. Strategists weren't buried under layers of account management, they were at the table with the clients. Creative directors weren't chasing trends, they were building brand DNA from the inside out. And perhaps most radically, we stopped measuring success by impressions or views. We started tracking resonance, real impact, the kind that turns customers into evangelists and brands into legacy. The more we focused on substance, the more we stood out. Agencies around us were still throwing money at influencer campaigns and empty social content while wondering why churn was rising. We were doing fewer things, but we were doing them well. And the industry started noticing. Invitations rolled in, not from vanity conferences, but from closed-door sessions with decision-makers who were tired of the noise. I was flown out to New York to speak at a private CMO forum. I gave a talk titled Strategy in the Age of Imitation. Afterward, 2 attendees approached me about training their internal brand teams. One even asked if I'd consider sitting on their advisory board. I wasn't sure where all of this was heading, but I knew one thing. I was never going back to the way it had been. Then came the moment I didn't see coming. One of the largest clients at S&V, a global healthcare tech firm that had been with the agency for over a decade, called a private meeting. They had seen the internal transformation and wanted me to know something. We're restructuring our agency relationships. We'd like to shift our full strategic scope to you personally, not to the agency, to Signal Route. It was a seismic moment. I could have turned it down out of loyalty. I could have deferred back to S&V. But I didn't. I accepted, on one condition. I would maintain dual collaboration status. The project would be executed through Signal Route, but we'd partner with S&V talent where it made sense. It wasn't a betrayal. It was an evolution. And to their credit, the board agreed. I became a partner and a competitor at the same time, and for the first time in my career, I didn't feel like I had to choose. I wasn't theirs or anyone else's. I was mine. The day the deal was finalized, I walked through the S&V offices, not as an employee, not even as a returning hero, but as an independent force, a strategist who had been fired, erased, and replaced, only to return with more power than ever. People didn't make speeches, there were no banners, but the respect in the air was unmistakable, and I didn't need them to clap. I just needed them to know that I hadn't come back to prove anything. I came back to finish what I started and build what they couldn't even see. Somewhere around 7 p.m., as the office began to empty out, I stood in the same hallway where Kendra had once smiled at me with condescension in her eyes. This time, there was no one there. Just my reflection in the glass and the echo of a truth I'd known all along. They had tried to erase me, but all they'd done was set the stage. Now I wasn't part of the story. I was writing the next chapter. 6 months later, I sat in my own office, not at Straighten & Vail, not at a shared desk or borrowed boardroom, but at the headquarters of Signal Route, the consultancy I'd built from a place of exhaustion and defiance. Now it stood as something entirely different, stable, trusted, respected. We had just signed our 10th long-term client. Our team had grown from 3 to 12. Our name was circulating in circles that had once ignored me entirely. I still partnered with S&V on occasion, but I no longer needed them. I no longer needed anyone's platform. I had built my own. The strange thing was, it wasn't a dramatic rise. There was no moment where the world stopped and gasped. It happened quietly. One project, one call, one client at a time. And I liked it that way. I didn't need noise. I had lived through enough noise to last a lifetime. What I wanted was control, clarity, ownership. I no longer had to explain myself in rooms that never valued me. I walked into rooms where I set the tone from the start, not because I demanded authority, but because I had earned it so thoroughly that people felt it before I even spoke. There were still challenges. Running your own business meant carrying every weight yourself, financial, operational, emotional, but I never regretted it. Every hour spent working for myself was better than a day spent justifying my worth to people who only saw value in youth or trends or volume. I finally understood why I'd stayed at S&V for so long. I hadn't believed there was anything better. I had convinced myself that being respected quietly was good enough. But it wasn't. It never was. One afternoon, I received a message from Harper. She was doing well. The storytelling studio had launched a project with a major education nonprofit, and she'd been promoted to creative lead. "Thank you for how you handled everything," she wrote. "You taught me more by not fighting me than any lecture ever could." I responded with honesty. "You didn't need a lecture, you just needed a chance to be something other than a placeholder." She didn't reply, but I could imagine her smile. She had found her place, and so had I. I also heard that Kendra had joined a startup accelerator in San Francisco. She was listed as a brand futurist, whatever that meant. I didn't wish her failure. I didn't think about her much at all anymore. The truth was, she had been a powerful catalyst. Without her dismissal, I might never have left. Without the insult, I might never have taken myself seriously enough to step out on my own. In a strange way, I owed her, not my success, but the clarity to chase it on my own terms. That evening, I stayed late at the office. The team had gone home after a long day of strategy reviews and client calls. I made tea, turned off the overhead lights, and looked out at the city. The same skyline I'd once stared at from S&B's boardroom window, wondering what would happen next. Now, I didn't have to wonder. I knew. I pulled out the notebook I'd started the day after I was fired. The first page was still there, a blank square where I had once written, "Start something." Now the pages were filled with outlines, plans, notes, strategies, evidence. Proof that it hadn't been a fluke, that what I had built mattered, that I mattered. I closed the notebook and smiled, not out of pride, but out of peace. I had spent years building something for someone else. Then they let me go like I was disposable. But what they never understood, what they never even thought to ask, was that I wasn't building it for them. I had always been building it for me. They just got to borrow it for a while. Now it was mine again, all of it, the work, the future, the voice. I didn't need their permission, I never had.